The U.S. campaign against the Maduro regime in Venezuela reaches a new high.
The Pentagon now sending the Navy's largest aircraft carrier strike group to the region, nearly doubling the number of U.S. forces there and adding to the B-1 bombers flown near Venezuela's coast this week.
Regime change. What a loaded phrase. If you're like me and you followed the America First and Make America Great Again platform and movement, I can't think of a concept that has been more castigated to the side, that's been more belittled by the regime change is the mistake of the past. We need to focus on the U.S. and our internal issues. That was a George Bush or a Reagan issue. That was the neocons. And yet, what has just occurred? Less than 2 months ago, Donald Trump was close to cutting a deal with Venezuela, where I'll explain it all as it kind of has occurred. And 30 days ago, all of a sudden switched tack and started, without any congressional authorization, bombing one-off drug smuggling boats without any due process, to the point the International Criminal Court has labeled it an extrajudicial killing, and in a way that past Republican Congresses would have been up in arms saying the War Powers Act, authorized and legislated after Vietnam, required that Congress be the authorizing body before the executive branch can in any way enter into military conflict. And yet, at the same time, when I turned on the news this morning, Lindsey Graham, the itinerant saber rattler, the consummate neocon, like military hawk, didn't take off the table the idea of American boots on the ground in Venezuela, and quite literally flirted with the concept of regime change in a way that just has me looking around and say, oh, am I the only one seeing this? Is this? How many times do we have to make the same mistake? So I'm going to lay out in quick order. Believe it or not, this isn't the first time Trump has tried to depose the dictator in Venezuela. We know exactly how that story went in his first administration, how it had the very unintended consequence of actually causing this mass migratory wave of asylum seekers in the U.S., how it actually caused that same Venezuelan dictatorship to cozy up with the U.S.'s most intimidating adversaries. And ultimately, I'm going to make the case for what I think is in the U.S. best interest today, and it is not the approach that I am seeing by our administration. So let me just dive in. Here's the really quick history. If you're like me and have gotten politically more activated in the last 4, 5, 6 years, I loosely remembered okay, didn't we do this before? Didn't Trump, under the auspices of narco-terrorism, call out at the time the Venezuelan strongman? If you've followed any Venezuelan history, here's just the 3 or 4 major bullet points. Man, there's a lot, so it's hard to summarize down. But the first one is 100 years ago, the U.S. believed Venezuela had the largest oil reserves on the planet. That was the common belief set. 50 years ago, Venezuela was the highest GDP per capita nation south of the U.S. It's actually a thriving, neoliberal capitalist society with, yes, wealth inequality, but huge construction, manufacturing, using the petrodollars fairly well, but often, once again, under the domain of strongmen, under these de facto dictators. And it wasn't until 93 where the name Hugo Chavez showed up, a socialist, charismatic, military man who ultimately drove a coup. It was a failed coup in like 93, 94, successfully elected, I think in 99. And until cancer started to finally weaken, this leader who is known, literally the term was like Hugo Chavez, Chavismo, like machismo. The guy had an aura. No ifs, ands, or buts. It was his right-hand man, a former bus driver and elementary school teacher who through the like bus driving unions made his way up all the way to the National Assembly and actually was appointed Hugo Chavez's right-hand man, that individual, Nicolás Maduro, who doesn't have the same bravado, didn't have the same strength in the polls, but was handpicked in 2013. And single-handedly, within a decade, 2013 to 23, ground down the Venezuelan GDP almost to a halt. We're talking 75 percentage points dropped in GDP. A hyperinflation that I've only ever seen in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. In the US, 4% inflation is scary. 6, 8%. We're talking 1.7 million% inflation. To the point that if you're just a working class Venezuelan family, the average salary with that kind of inflation the entire salary, you couldn't afford a single, it was like either a gallon or like let's call it a gallon of rice. Just these crazy stats. It's deplorable how quickly one individual dismantled their economy. Out of the 180 nations tracked, Venezuela ranks 177th for the most corruption. He propped up a handful of elites and cronies in a way that, yes, protected his power, but at the same time came with mass, intentional oppression, and we're talking like jailing of all opposition, the journalist class, just like right out of the strong man's playbook. That's Hugo Chavez. That's Nicolás Maduro. To the point that Trump starts to really take issue with him. Yes, from 2016, but really in 2018, when Nicolás Maduro is clearly losing the polls, stuffs ballot boxes. I won't draw too much attention to the hilarity of Trump calls him out for falsifying the election results. You can enjoy that for what it's worth. And Trump tries to then quickly prop up the lead opposition, a much more U.S.-friendly individual, last name Gado, who Nicolás Maduro, once again, like systematically removed from any real competition. That's 2018. That story continues to the point that it's so crazy. Like in my schooling, I read lots about the Bay of Pigs and how much of just a disaster that was under JFK's administration. Today, Venezuelans all just chuckle at what they call the Bay of Piglets, which is Trump endorsing a couple former Green Berets who then trained only 60 Venezuelan dissidents to try to attack Nicolás Maduro at his seaside palace, but it was so thoroughly botched. Their boats ran out of oil, their GPS stopped working. So they literally just floated right towards Maduro's private security. And all of a sudden, it's like Trump, in the ways that he was trying to prop up the opposition, it actually played 100% into Maduro's hands in the way that attempted and failed regime change so often does. I did a long bit on this around whether or not the U.S. should take part in Netanyahu's request to bomb the nuclear facilities in Iran. And one of the things that I outlined is, hey, it'll help Iranians, or it'll help the regime rally Iranians to the flag, and I guarantee it'll then lead to the Iranian regime taking all of their nuclear efforts 100% underground, both of which is what occurred within just the last couple of weeks. Failed regime change, where it's really clear there's an outsider that's meddling, has that effect every time. And that's exactly what happened after Trump botched the Bay of Piglets and helped empower Maduro for another term. And now here's where it's so interesting. After that lesson that was so clear, if anything, some of the main reasons Trump didn't act according to some of his instincts to be even more aggressive and actually put American troops on the ground in Venezuela was because of names like Jim Mattis and H.R. McAllister. The leaders of the U.S. Defense Department that were willing to stand up to Trump in his first term. But now all of a sudden, Trump 2.0, where are we? It's still the fact that Nicolás Maduro is a unequivocally evil dictator. Those aren't my words. That's the UN has used similar terminology, numerous other world leaders. Maduro is so cozied up to our adversaries, taking loans from China, weapons from Russia. I've read reports that quite literally Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militia, primarily out of Lebanon, actually has troops in Venezuela. Like it's a spooky set of kind of affordances that we've given our adversaries to actually meddle in our sphere of influence, the Western Hemisphere. And yet, Trump now was considering cutting a deal. And this is where it gets really interesting. Considering cutting a deal with Maduro for the first 6 months of his administration, saying, hey, if you enact these couple requests, we'll actually stop sanctioning your oil. All this is stuff that's leaked. I've been trying to follow it. And it wasn't until Marco Rubio, also a longtime defense hawk, said, no. We need to switch the narrative from election-denying despot to actually Venezuela being like the core driver of fentanyl deaths in the U.S. I listened to an interview this week where the interviewer asked Rubio, okay, Venezuela's a bad spot. And it's in America's best interest for their opposition to rise up and successfully take the mantle of power. But Rubio said, well, hey, you've got it wrong. I don't care. This is a direct quote. I don't care what the UN says about whether or not Venezuela is smuggling fentanyl into the U.S. Doesn't matter. I know that they are. Whoa. Okay. Because everything that I've read is, yes, the dictatorship in Venezuela is evil. But the interesting one is, compared to all illicit drugs smuggled into the U.S., Venezuela accounts for 2% or less. And primarily, it's all cocaine, not fentanyl, which is the leading driver of drug-related deaths in the U.S. So it's this really interesting narrative switch around, this is another direct quote, that Maduro is a drug kingpin, and therefore the U.S. needs to pursue narco-terrorist, like that's the official terminology, defense against what his regime is doing. And that's why I want to bring it right back to the top around Trump bombing now a dozen different boats in the Caribbean, some of which have been proven not to carry drugs at all, in a way that both breaks down on American tradition, constitutional expectation, international law around each person's right to fair trial, that evidence should be brought forth on their behalf, and that kind of bombing, it's still inexcusable in like the fog of war, but to not have any interest explicitly to actually go through Congress and get any of these approvals is another one of these really systematic slap in the face to our constitutional order. That's not what our founding fathers intended, for a U.S. president to be able to, at their whim, bomb boats in the Caribbean and international waters, and then much less post it on Instagram for everyone to see. For me, that's calling balls and strikes as I see them. That is another red line around our constitutional order that I have to take issue with. And then when I quickly jump to, and what are the next implications here? After Trump's first round of sanctions on Maduro in the 2018 timeframe, it exacerbated their economic spiral. And all of a sudden, Venezuela quickly ranked as one of the top asylum-seeking countries of origin. Meaning, compared after Mexico, typically most illegal immigrants to the U.S. were coming from Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala. You see Venezuela spike, and if we get right into the brass tacks of what most analysts I read are expecting, for Trump to destabilize Venezuela anymore, the statistical likelihood that it leads to a quick, straightforward regime change to someone that is an ally to the U.S. it's super unlikely. These types of attempted regime change only foster chaos. They undercut the political opposition's credibility, and it opens the door for already one of the most complicated and dangerous parts of the hemisphere, where there are, just in Colombia and their neighbor, like there's a 50-year civil war of belligerents that are already ready to seize an opening. There are so many different, whether you call them militias or gangs in that region, that have had generations of training that would be thrilled to carve up Venezuela's massed oil reserves. To assume that the U.S. can actually have a positive outcome is really foolhardy. And it just has all the echoes of Libya, and Syria, and Iraq, and things that I saw up close and personal when I lived out there. And it's unfortunately, it's a very similar dynamic to what I fear would occur in Iran, where either these attempts at regime change either bolster the current leadership, in this case Maduro, or it gives credence to militias to fill the vacuum. And when you read that analysis, that would guarantee not what occurred in 2018, where the rate of Venezuelan immigrants trying to flee to the U.S. grew by 250 to 300%. We're talking like a net new 14 million refugees in our hemisphere. This isn't Syria. This isn't wherever that is, 7,000, 8,000 miles away, disconnected by an ocean or two. That's a people group with a land route directly to our front door, our southern border. It's there's so many of these strange paradoxes that I just can't get my head around. That Trump is chastising Maduro for election fraud, where at the same time he's propping up the same issue in Brazil with Bolsonaro. And is expecting to actually rectify the situation in Venezuela, when in fact what has already occurred is it helped our adversaries get a foothold, and it sent 300% more asylum seekers to our border. That loop is only going to continue. Maduro will be forced even further into our adversaries' clutches, and 14 million new refugees will be looking for sanctuary. The exact issue that Trump's trying to avoid. So I want to end here, yes, by painting a really clear picture of what's at stake, but then more so just zoom out and do what I keep trying to do, which is, if I were in DC, what would I be advocating for? And it's actually something that I believe really has the flavoring of America First, which is we've got a lot of issues going on in our country right now. The cost of living is only skyrocketing. Sending another $20 billion bailout to help prop up the Argentinian leader doesn't make sense when your government's shut down. Considering another foreign invasion when the Gaza-Israeli situation is holding on by a hair, where Putin is signaling zero interest in negotiating, we can't afford now a third front when actually the only adversary that matters is China. It just really doesn't make sense. And instead, there are so many tools in the US's diplomatic toolkit that will be far, far more effective of both applying pressure on Maduro through sanctions. Yes, national sanctions, but sanctions on him, his family, all his cronies and the oligarchs, the 0.1% that actually are benefiting from his regime, while at the same time helping support, not through CIA covert operations, which was just officially, publicly endorsed by Trump, but instead by fostering a multinational support for the opposition. Machado, right now, the Nobel Peace Prize winner who is effectively in hiding because her life is so at risk. How can not just the US, but all of Latin America support her and her bravery and her cause? And then, man, beyond the funding, helping guarantee that Maduro doesn't turn off the Wi-Fi every time there's a protest. There's a solution for that. It's called Starlink. There are all of these tactics, these tools in the tool belt that have the exact opposite effect. These types of conflicts, for me, always start with not the military warfare, but the information warfare. How can the U.S. explain the U.S., we've got big issues we're focused on ourselves, but we care about the people of Venezuela. We care about their flourishing. And we care about them achieving not the American dream, but the Venezuelan dream. And in fact, supporting free market, pluralistic societies built upon freedoms, not corruption. That's what the U.S. wants for Venezuela. And this is how we're doing it in a way that's much different from military confrontation. And instead, supporting the local people and guaranteeing we aren't meddling. We're here to help in these small tactical ways that actually creates daylight for the opposition to rally the nation behind them and create durable change that isn't regime change. It's electoral change with a new mandate and a completely different storyline in the minds of Venezuelans that will stick, and it won't pave the way for our adversaries to get a further foothold. It won't pave the way for the Colombian militias right across the border to seize the natural resources. There are ways to go about this that have historically been far more effective than what I've tracked to be the previous 70 attempts post-World War II by the U.S. at enacting regime change just in Latin America. 70. It's an egregious track record that has not worked. And if anything, it doesn't take much to connect the dots to how that attempted regime change fostered the instability that drives the waves of asylum seekers to our southern border every day. The narrative needs to change. And regime change is not that change. We've exhausted that playbook and it doesn't work. So, if you've made it this far, thanks for listening. I've been following this one a lot this weekend. I'm recording it 9 p.m. on a Sunday. So if you find this interesting when you're listening on a Monday or a Tuesday, send it to your friends. Chances are, if Trump bombed 3 boats last week, he's going to do it again. When that pops up, send it to 2 friends and help get this story out with me. All right. Thanks so much and see you next week.